The alkali dust clung to everything Maeve owned, which amounted to her father's canvas sack, the tools inside it, and the worn wool blanket slung over her shoulder. Agnes, her stepmother, had made the pronouncement from the dry porch of the house her father had built, her voice as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. The Lord provides for the righteous, not for strange girls who court sorrow. They had until sundown. Now the sun was a molten smear on the horizon, bleeding orange and purple into the vast, indifferent sky, and the town of Providence was a memory of lamplight shrinking at her back. Her dog, a lean German shepherd named Ghost, padded beside her, his breath pluming in the cooling air. He carried no judgment, only a steady, watchful presence that was more comfort than any human voice had been in a year. The sack was heavy, its contents clinking with a dull, metallic rhythm against her hip, a rock hammer, a set of chisels, a sharpening stone, and a tarnished silver canteen her father had carried through 2 territories. These were the things Agnes had not wanted, the remnants of a man who understood the language of stone and silence, a language Maeve had inherited. The weight was a comfort, a physical connection to the man who had taught her to read the bones of the earth. He had shown her the subtle shifts in color that betrayed a water seep, the way a line of hardy greasewood could trace a hidden spring, the sound the wind made when it funneled through a stable rock formation. "The land will tell you its secrets," he used to say, his voice a low rumble like stones shifting deep underground. "If you're quiet enough to listen." She was quiet now. The silence of the high desert pressed in, broken only by the scuff of her worn boots and the soft panting of the dog. She was walking toward the Scablands, a brutal expanse of fractured mesas and wind-carved canyons that the people of Providence avoided. They said it was godless country, a place where a soul could get lost and never be found. To Maeve, it felt like the only place left that wouldn't try to shrink her, to squeeze her into a shape she didn't fit. She had no destination, only a direction, away. Away from the pitying glances, the whispers that followed her like burrs, the suffocating piety of a town that mistook grief for a moral failing. Her sorrow was a quiet thing, a cold stone in her gut, not the wailing performance they seemed to expect. And because it was quiet, they deemed it unnatural. They saw her solitary walks, her preference for the company of the dog, her study of the rocks her father had loved, and they called it strange. Agnes had simply given their whispers a voice. The cold was beginning to bite, a dry, penetrating chill that promised a bitter night. She scanned the rock faces, her eyes tracing the fissures and faults, not with despair, but with a focused, searching intensity. She was looking for a place to stop, a place to weather the darkness. It was then that she saw it, a shadow within a shadow, a vertical line against a sheer cliff face that was too straight, too perfect to be a simple crack. It was a flaw in the mountain's skin, an invitation. Ghost whined softly, pressing against her leg, but she laid a calming hand on his head. Her father's words echoed in her memory, a story told by a campfire years ago about mountains that weren't solid, mountains that had lungs and hollow spaces where the wind sang. She moved toward the fissure, the last of the light catching the raw, sharp edges of the stone. It was no wider than her shoulders, a dark, uninviting moor that smelled of cold stone and deep earth. It was a place most would fear. For Maeve, it was the first thing that had looked like a promise all day. She squeezed her shoulders through the opening, the rough sandstone scraping at her coat, and the world outside vanished. The wind, which had been a constant companion, was instantly silenced. The air inside was still, cold, and carried the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and undisturbed. Ghost hesitated at the entrance, a low growl rumbling in his chest, until she made a soft clicking sound with her tongue. He pushed through after her, his body a warm, reassuring pressure against her legs in the absolute darkness. She stood for a long moment, letting her eyes adjust, but there was no light to adjust to. This was a profound, bottomless black that felt solid, as if she could reach out and touch it. She fumbled in her sack, her fingers finding the small tin of matches and the stub of a candle. The match scraped, flared, and the tiny flame pushed back the immense darkness, revealing not a narrow crack, but the beginning of a space. The walls were close, but they were smoothly curved, sculpted by water that must have flowed through here eons ago. The passage sloped gently downward, and she followed it, holding the candle aloft. The light threw their shadows, huge and distorted, against the rippling stone. Ghost stayed close, his nails clicking softly on the rock floor. After 40 feet of cautious shuffling, the narrow passage suddenly opened into a chamber. She held the candle higher, and the small flame seemed to gasp at the sheer scale of the space it was trying to illuminate. The room was immense, a vast, vaulted cavern with a ceiling that soared into blackness beyond the reach of her light. The air was breathable, cool but not stagnant, suggesting another opening somewhere, a connection to the world above. In the center of the chamber, a cluster of massive rockfalls formed a sort of natural pillar, and around it, the floor was a mix of sand and smooth, worn stone. She walked the perimeter, the candlelight dancing across walls of dark red and ochre sandstone. In one corner, a steady, patient drip of water fell from a fissure high above, landing in a shallow, basin-like depression in the rock, which was full to the brim with water so clear it was almost invisible. The sound was the only thing that gave it away, a quiet, rhythmic plink that was the cavern's slow, steady heartbeat. This was more than a shelter, it was a secret world. A place Providence, with its small fears and smaller mercies, could never touch. She felt a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in a year, a tiny, fragile seed of something that felt like hope. She set down her sack and her blanket, the small act feeling momentous, a declaration. This would be the place. She would make it a home. Her father had taught her that a home wasn't about 4 walls and a roof, it was about a hearth. A source of warmth and light. Her eye scanned the soaring ceiling again, searching. She followed the curve of the wall with her candle, looking for a sign, a clue from the stone itself. And then she found it. A dark stain, a streak of black soot that ran from a high, narrow crack in the ceiling all the way down to a natural alcove in the wall. It was a flue. A natural chimney, carved by geology and time. Someone, or something, had made a fire here before. Perhaps a very, very long time ago. The knowledge settled in her not with fear, but with a sense of continuity, of finding a place in a story that had begun long before she arrived. She ran her hand over the cold, soot-stained rock. The stone was solid, a type of layered shale and sandstone she recognized. It would hold heat. It would be safe. She looked at Ghost, who was sniffing intently at the damp sand near the water seep, his tail giving a slow, tentative wag. He looked up at her, and in the flickering candlelight, his eyes seemed to understand. They were no longer just running away. They were arriving. The first task was light, a more permanent solution than a dwindling candle. Maeve left the main chamber, returning to the narrow entrance passage. She spent hours with her father's rock hammer, carefully chipping away at a section of the wall where a vein of translucent mica ran through the sandstone. He had called it fool's silver, but also sunstone, for the way it could capture and hold light. She worked patiently, the sharp tap-tap-tap of the hammer the only sound in the deep silence. She remembered his hands, calloused and sure, showing her how to strike the rock just so, not to shatter the delicate sheets, but to free them from their stone prison. Each thin, pearlescent plate she prized loose was a victory. Back in the main cavern, she used clay she dug from the damp area around the water seep, mixing it with sand to form a crude but effective mortar. She built small, 3-sided boxes of flat stones, leaving the front open, and used the clay to seal a pane of mica over the opening. Inside each, she placed a small clay dish, which she filled with rendered fat scavenged from a deer carcass she found in the canyons and a wick made from a frayed piece of her blanket. When she lit the first one, the effect was magical. The flame, protected from drafts, burned with a steady, clean light, and the mica sheet diffused it into a soft, golden glow that pushed the oppressive darkness back into the far corners of the ether. It was a gentle, living light that made the cavern feel less like a cave and more like a room. Next came the hearth. This was the heart of the entire endeavor, and she approached it with a reverence learned from her father. The natural alcove and flue were a gift from the mountain, but the fireplace itself had to be built. She spent days hauling suitable flat stones from the rockfall in the center of the chamber, sorting them by size and thickness. Using her hammer and chisel, she shaped them, squaring the edges, creating interlocking pieces like a giant stone puzzle. The work was grueling. Her muscles ached, her hands were raw, but her focus was absolute. She was not just stacking stones, she was building safety, she was building warmth, she was building a future. She used the same clay sand mortar to bind the stones, laying a thick, solid foundation and then building the walls of the firebox up, angling them inward to direct the smoke and heat up the natural chimney. She constructed a raised hearth to keep the fire off the damp ground and a wide stone mantel. It took a week of constant, back-breaking labor. When it was finished, she stood back and surveyed her work. It was rough, imperfect, but it was solid. It was real. She gathered dry brush and scrub from the canyons outside, a risky venture that required her to be watchful and quick, and laid the first fire. When the kindling caught and the flames licked up the stones, roaring to life and sending a steady column of smoke straight up the flue, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment that was almost painful in its intensity. The warmth spread through the cavern, chasing away the deep, permanent chill of the rock. The stone of the hearth began to absorb the heat, radiating it back out into the space. Her father's voice was in her head again. "Stone remembers heat," he'd said. "Feed it warmth, and it will feed it back to you when you need it most." Ghost, who had watched the entire process with quiet curiosity, came and lay before the fire, stretching out with a contented groan, his coat glowing in the firelight. Maeve sat beside him, the heat soaking into her bones, and watched the flames dance. This was hers. She had made it. She had taken a cold, dark, empty space and filled it with light and warmth. With the hearth established, the cavern began to transform from a shelter into a home. Survival shifted toward permanence. The next necessity was food, and a way to store it. The high desert was stingy, but it provided if you knew where to look. Maeve spent her days foraging, gathering pine nuts from the few hardy pinyons that grew in sheltered crevices, digging for starchy yucca roots, and collecting the tart, vitamin-rich fruit of the prickly pear cactus, carefully burning off the spines in her new fire. She learned the patterns of the jackrabbits and set simple snares, providing a steady source of protein. Every scrap of food was precious, and she needed a place to keep it safe from damp and the small creatures that might find their way into her sanctuary. The sandstone walls of the cavern, though hard, were softer than the granite she'd grown up with. She chose a section of wall near the hearth, where the gentle warmth would keep the air dry, and began to carve. Using her father's sharpest chisel and a heavy mallet, she started the slow, laborious process of hollowing out shelves and niches directly into the rock. The rhythmic scrape and chip of her tools became the new soundtrack of her life. Each shelf was a testament to patience. She worked for weeks, her arms and back screaming with the effort, until she had a series of deep, smooth-walled cubbies. Here she stored her dried meat, her bags of nuts, her carefully preserved roots. It was a larder born of the mountain itself, secure and dry. But she knew that foraging and trapping were unreliable. She needed a more stable food source. She needed chickens. The idea was audacious. Raising fowl underground seemed impossible. But the cavern was vast, and she had seen a smaller, secondary chamber leading off the main one, connected by a low, narrow passage. It was drier than the main room and had its own network of tiny fissures in the ceiling that allowed for a slow but steady exchange of air. This would be the coop. Getting the chickens was the greatest risk she had taken since leaving Providence. She had found a small, glittering seam of quartz laced with veins of silver while exploring a washout miles from her cave, not enough to make a man rich, but enough for a trade. She bundled the heavy, promising rocks in a piece of canvas and made the long trek to the isolated cabin of Old Man Hemlock, a trapper who lived on the far side of the Scablands and rarely went to town. He was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and sun damage. He looked at the ore she laid on his rough-hewn table, then at her, his eyes sharp and missing nothing. He didn't ask her name or where she was living. He simply nodded. "What do you need?" was all he said. "For hens and a rooster," she replied, her voice hoarse from disuse. He grunted, disappeared into a lean-to behind his cabin, and returned with a wooden crate containing the birds. He also pushed a small sack of grain and a half-full tin of lard across the table toward her. It was more than a fair trade. It was a kindness, offered without question or judgment. He was the silent ally she hadn't known she had. The journey back with the crated, clucking birds was fraught with tension, but she made it. Inside the mountain, she released them into their new, stone home. She built nesting boxes from scavenged wood and filled the floor with dry sand. In the main chamber, she cultivated a small patch of phosphorescent moss she found growing near the water seep, its faint, eerie glow providing just enough light for the chickens to see by. Their quiet clucking and scratching brought a strange, domestic life to the ancient stone space. The first time she found an egg, a perfect, pale brown orb nestled in a nesting box, she held it in her palm and felt a wave of emotion so strong it made her dizzy. It was proof. Proof that life could not only survive here, but flourish. Her existence settled into a rhythm dictated by the needs of her small, hidden world. Mornings were for tending the chickens, providing them with grain and water, and searching for the precious eggs they provided. The middle of the day, when the sun was highest and the world outside was brightest, was for venturing out. She was a ghost on the landscape, moving with quiet purpose through the canyons and mesas. She never went near the trails that led to Providence, instead forging her own paths, becoming as much a part of the wild country as the hawks that circled overhead. Ghost was her shadow and her sentinel, his keen senses alerting her to any presence long before she could see or hear it. He would freeze, a low rumble in his chest, and she would melt into the rocks, waiting until the danger, or the curiosity, passed. Sometimes she would see them from a distance, a rider from town, a prospector, their forms small and insignificant against the vastness of the land. She felt no connection to them, no longing. They belonged to a world that had cast her out, and she was content in the one she had built. The people of Providence did not forget her entirely. She became a piece of local lore, the strange girl who had walked into the scablands and vanished. Some said she had died of exposure within a week. Others whispered that she had been taken by spirits. A few, like Mr. Corwin, the town's self-important mercantile owner, spoke of her with a particular brand of contempt reserved for those who defy easy explanation. He had been the one to most loudly support Agnes's decision. Maeve had once overheard him speaking to another man in front of his store, gesturing vaguely toward the forbidding mountains. Playing house with the coyotes, he'd scoffed, his voice carrying on the dry wind. The devil takes his own. The words had been meant to sting, to reinforce his own standing in a community that valued conformity above all else. But to Maeve, crouched behind a rock outcropping half a mile away, the words had no power. Her house was made of stone, warmed by a fire she had built with her own hands. She had water, food, and the unwavering loyalty of her dog. The devil had no place there. Her father had taught her not only how to work stone, but how to read the sky. He had shown her the signs that preceded the big storms, the ones that could change the world in a matter of hours. And as autumn deepened into winter, she began to see them. The sunsets grew unnaturally vivid, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and violent orange. The high, thin cirrus clouds, which he'd called a mare's tails, began to stream in from the north, a sign of turbulent air in the upper atmosphere. The most telling sign was the silence. The coyotes stopped their nightly songs. The birds grew quiet. The air itself felt heavy, holding its breath. There was a change in the quality of the light, a crystalline sharpness that made the distant peaks seem unnervingly close. A deep, instinctual part of her, the part that had learned to listen to the land, knew that something was coming. Something big. She began to prepare with a grim, focused intensity. She spent every daylight hour gathering fuel, hauling deadfall and dry sagebrush back to the cave, stacking it high against a far wall. She doubled her snares, smoking and drying every bit of meat she caught. She sealed the smaller fissures in her living space with clay, leaving only the main chimney flue and the carefully hidden entrance. She brought the chickens into the main chamber, their coop now a small, penned-in area near the fire, their nervous clucking a counterpoint to the growing silence outside. Ghost was restless, pacing the cavern and whining softly, his eyes fixed on the sealed entrance as if he could see the approaching threat through solid rock. Maeve felt the pressure dropping in her own bones, a dull ache that her father had always called his weather sensor. The storm was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty, a malevolent presence gathering its strength just over the horizon. The first flakes of snow were not gentle. They were hard, granular pellets, driven by a wind that shrieked down from the northern peaks like a banshee. Maeve stood for a moment at the mouth of her fissure, watching the world outside disappear into a maelstrom of white. The wind had teeth, a biting, soul-deep cold that felt different from any winter chill she had ever known. She and Ghost retreated into the passage, and she rolled a massive, carefully chosen boulder into place, blocking the entrance. It wasn't a perfect seal, but it muffled the scream of the wind to a low moan and stopped the driving snow. Plunged into the familiar, firelit world of her cavern, the storm outside felt like a distant rumor. But she could feel its power in the way the very mountain seemed to hum around her, a deep, vibrational tremor that spoke of the immense forces being unleashed upon it. For 2 days, she remained in her sanctuary. The fire burned steadily, the stone of the hearth a solid bastion of warmth. She tended her chickens, ate her smoked rabbit and yucca roots, and sharpened her father's tools, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone a meditative, calming act. Ghost lay by the fire, sleeping in fits, occasionally lifting his head to listen to the muted howl of the wind. She thought of Providence, of its flimsy wooden houses and its glass-paned windows. She imagined the wind tearing at the shingles, the snow piling up against the doors. She felt a flicker of something, not pity, not yet, but a clinical understanding of their vulnerability. They had built their lives on an assumption of mercy from the land, a mercy the land was not obliged to give. They had mistaken a season of calm for a permanent state of being. Her father had always warned against that. Never turn your back on the mountain, he'd say. It was here long before you, and it'll be here long after. You don't conquer it. You ask its permission to stay. Providence had never asked permission. It had simply imposed itself, a grid of straight lines and false certainties on a landscape that prized patience and curves. The storm was the mountain's answer. On the 3rd day, a new sound began to permeate the stone. A high-pitched, incessant ticking, like a million tiny hammers against the rock above. It was sleet, freezing rain that was coating everything in a shell of ice. She knew what this meant. The weight. The snow was heavy, but ice was crushing. Roofs would begin to fail. Trees would shatter. The world outside was being entombed. She felt a strange detachment, the calm of a ship's captain in the eye of a hurricane. She had done all she could. Her preparations were sound. Her shelter was strong. She was a creature of the rock now, and the storm was a battle being fought on the surface, a world away. She had not built her home to spite Providence. She had built it to survive. But in surviving, she had created a fortress, a bastion of warmth and life in the heart of a frozen, dying world. The irony was as cold and sharp as the ice forming outside. The very act of self-sufficiency that had caused them to cast her out was now the only thing of real value. They had scorned her for turning to the stone, and now the stone was the only thing that could save anyone. The thought brought her no satisfaction, only a deep and profound weariness. The world was about to be remade, and she had no idea what her place in it would be when the wind finally stopped screaming and the silence returned. In Providence, the world had shrunk to the size of a single, freezing room. Mr. Corwin huddled with his wife, Martha, and their 2 small children, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The mercantile, his pride and the symbol of his status, was failing. The pot-bellied stove in the center of the room, which normally kept the place sweltering, now fought a losing battle against the invasive cold. A fine layer of snow covered the floor, blown in through the cracks in the walls. The windows were opaque, coated in a thick armor of ice. The roar of the wind was a constant, physical assault on the senses, punctuated by the terrifying crack and groan of the building itself. The roof was sagging under a weight it was never designed to bear. Fear, a cold and unfamiliar snake, was coiled tight in his belly. He had always been a man of certainty, of ledgers and profits, of social order and his rightful place at its top. He believed in solid, sensible things, wood, glass, iron, and the judgment of his peers. He had dismissed Maeve as an aberration, a foolish girl courting tragedy. Now, his own solid, sensible world was being crushed by a force he couldn't reason with or intimidate. "It's getting colder, Thomas," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. Their daughter, barely 6, was shivering uncontrollably in her arms, her lips tinged with blue. He looked at them, at the faces of the people he was supposed to protect, and the snake of fear tightened its grip. All his money, all his standing, all his loud opinions were useless. They were going to die here. They were going to freeze, slowly and miserably, in the dark. It was then that a memory surfaced, unbidden. A flicker of an image from a few weeks back. He'd been riding on the edge of the scablands, checking a boundary fence, and had seen a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from the base of the cliffs. It came from a place the locals called the Devil's Jaw, a jagged outcropping of rock. He'd thought it was just an odd updraft, a trick of the light. But now, in the desperate calculus of survival, the memory ignited a spark. Smoke meant fire. And fire meant life. It meant her. The girl he had scorned. The thought was galling, a bitter pill of humiliation. To seek help from the outcast, the strange child he had so publicly condemned. It was an admission of utter failure. But then he looked at his daughter's face, pale and still in the gloom, and his pride shattered. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about her. "Stay here," he said, his voice a cracked rasp. "Keep them close." He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped his face in a scarf, and grabbed a coil of rope and a lantern. The act of opening the door was a battle. The wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it back against the wall, and a wave of ice and snow exploded into the room. He fought his way out, pulling the door shut against the storm's fury. Outside was a nightmare. The world was gone, replaced by a screaming vortex of white. He could barely see 10 feet in front of him. The snow was waist-deep, but it was the ice that made it treacherous, a slick, uneven crust that broke under his weight. He fell, again and again, his hands and knees raw and bleeding. He had only a general sense of direction, a desperate faith in the image of that wisp of smoke. He was a man of the town, lost and helpless in the face of the raw, untamed land. Every fear he possessed rose up from the depths of his mind. He would freeze out here, a monument to his own arrogance. But the image of his daughter's blue-tinged lips drove him on. He clawed his way through drifts, shielded his face from the ice pellets that stung like hornets, and pushed toward the dark shape of the mountains, a man stripped of everything but a single, desperate hope. He found the fissure more by luck than skill, stumbling into the relative shelter of the cliff face and seeing the dark line against the snow-blasted rock. He was on the verge of collapse, his body racked with shivers, his mind numb with cold. He fell against the boulder blocking the entrance, his fists beating a weak, frantic rhythm against the unyielding stone. He shouted her name, but the wind tore the sound from his lips and flung it into the blizzard. It was hopeless. He sank to his knees, a wave of despair washing over him. He was going to die here, at the door of the one person who might have saved him. And then he saw it. A flicker of movement. The massive boulder shifted, grinding inward, pushed from the other side. A gap appeared, spilling a rectangle of warm, golden light onto the snow. Maeve stood there, silhouetted against the glow, her dog at her side, a low growl rumbling in its chest. She held a lantern, and its light illuminated his pathetic, frozen state. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. There was no shock, no fear, no triumph. She simply looked at him, waiting. All the things he had planned to say, the justifications, the carefully worded requests, died in his throat. He was a beggar, and all that was left was the raw, ugly truth. "Help us," he croaked, the words broken by shudders. "My family. The children. We're freezing." He expected questions, accusations. He expected her to demand an apology, to savor his humiliation. He deserved it. But she didn't. Her gaze shifted past him, out into the screaming white. She seemed to be listening, not to him, but to the storm. Her focus was entirely on the practical reality of the situation. "How many are with you?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, steady, and stripped of all emotion. It was the most terrifying and comforting sound he had ever heard. It was the voice of pure competence. "My wife," he stammered, "my 2 children. And the gables next door, their roof collapsed. A boy with a broken leg. 7 of us." In the mercantile she gave a single, sharp nod. "Stay here," she commanded, not him, but the dog. Ghost sat instantly, his intelligent eyes fixed on Corwin, a silent, furry warden. Maeve disappeared back into the warmth and returned a moment later, wrapped in a heavy cloak, carrying a coil of rope and 2 more lanterns. She pushed one into his hands. "Your light is failing," she said. It was a simple statement of fact, but it felt like a judgment on his entire life. She looked him over, her eyes taking in his inadequate clothing, his frozen hands. She ducked back inside and returned with a pair of thick, fur-lined mittens. Put these on he did, his fingers clumsy and numb. She secured the rope around her own waist and handed him the other end. "Tie this around you. The wind will try to separate us. Do not let go." He fumbled with the knot, his shivering making it difficult. She watched him for a second, then stepped forward and efficiently tied it for him with practiced, sure movements. She was in control. She was the authority here. The world had been turned upside down. "We must be quick," she said, turning her face toward the storm. "Show me the way," and with that, she stepped out into the blizzard, a small, determined figure pulling him, the man who had scorned her, back toward the town she had been forced to leave. The journey back was a descent into hell. The wind was a solid wall, and Maeve moved into it like a swimmer fighting a current, her head down, her steps sure and planted. Corwin stumbled behind her, kept from being blown away only by the rope that connected them. She was the anchor in the storm. The mercantile was a tomb of cold and despair. When Maeve pushed the door open, the sight that greeted her was devastating. The families were huddled together under a pile of blankets, barely moving. The air was frigid, their breath hanging in ghostly clouds. Mrs. Gable was trying to comfort her son, who was pale with pain from his crudely splintered leg. Martha Corwin looked up, her eyes wide and hollow, and saw her husband, and then the strange, cloaked girl behind him. There was no time for explanations. Maeve's presence filled the room with an unnerving calm and a clear, unspoken authority. She moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who lives by action, not words. "Get by the fire," she said, her voice cutting through the frozen silence. It wasn't a request. She handed a lantern to Corwin. "Keep this light here." Help them while he and Martha roused the others. Maeve went to the pot-bellied stove. It was nearly out, a few dying embers glowing in the ash. The woodpile was empty. She didn't waste a moment asking questions. She strode to a heavy oak counter, braced herself, and with a strength that seemed impossible for her slight frame, heaved it over onto its side. Then she took a small, sharp hatchet from a loop on her belt and began, with powerful, economic swings, to break it apart. The sound of the splintering wood was a shock, a violation of the room's lethargic despair. It was the sound of survival. She fed the fresh wood into the stove, skillfully coaxing the embers back to life until a proper fire was roaring, casting a life-giving warmth and a flickering, hopeful light into the room. She moved to the injured boy next, her touch gentle but firm as she examined his leg. She sent Corwin to fetch snow, which she melted in a pot on the stove. From a small leather pouch, she produced a bundle of dried herbs, which she steeped in the hot water, filling the air with a clean, sharp scent. "Drink this," she commanded, handing a warm cup to the boy, then to the others. It was a simple willow bark tea, something her father had used for pain and fever. To the freezing, terrified townspeople, it felt like a magic elixir. The warmth spread through their bodies, chasing away the deep chill. She worked tirelessly, a whirlwind of quiet competence. She found sacks of flour and beans, and soon had a thick, nourishing stew bubbling on the stove. She resplintered the boy's leg, using broken pieces of a chair and strips of canvas, her movements precise and confident. Corwin watched her, mesmerized. This was the girl they had cast out, the strange, silent child. He had called her weak, unnatural. But here, in the crucible of a crisis that had broken him, she was a force of nature. She didn't speak of the past. She didn't look at him with accusation. Her focus was entirely on the present, on the tasks that needed doing: warmth, water, food, shelter. She was saving them, and she was doing it without hesitation, without a single word of reproach. Later, when the immediate danger had passed and the survivors were huddled near the stove, wrapped in blankets and sipping the hot stew, Corwin found himself sitting on a crate near the fire, watching her check the bindings on the boy's splint. The shame he felt was a physical weight, a sickness in his gut. He had been so wrong, so blind, so cruel in his certainty. "I said things," he said, his voice low and rough. He didn't look at her, but at the fire. "About you." "I was wrong." Maeve finished her task and looked up. Her eyes, in the firelight, held no anger, only a vast, sober stillness. She did not offer absolution or forgiveness. She simply acknowledged his words with a small nod, then turned her attention to his daughter, who had crept closer, her fear replaced by a child's open curiosity. The girl pointed to the intricate knot Maeve had used on the splint. "Who taught you to tie that?" she asked, her voice small. Maeve looked at the girl, and for the first time, a flicker of softness entered her expression. "My father taught me," she said, her voice quiet. "He said a good knot is the difference between holding on and letting go." She then looked back at the fire, her gaze distant. "He also taught me about stone. He said stone remembers heat. You just have to give it a reason to." The blizzard raged for 2 more days, but inside the mercantile, a small pocket of humanity endured. Maeve became the undisputed center of their small universe. Her quiet authority, born not of position but of pure, practical knowledge, was absolute. She rationed the food, tended to the sick, and maintained the fire, her energy seeming limitless. The townsfolk, who had once whispered about her, now watched her with a kind of reverence. They saw not strangeness, but a deep, formidable strength. They had lived their lives buffered by the fragile certainties of their community, and when those certainties shattered, they had been helpless. Maeve had no such buffers. She had been forced to face the world on its own brutal terms, and in doing so, had learned its true language. When the wind finally died and a pale, watery sunlight filtered through the ice-caked windows, the world it revealed was unrecognizable. Providence was buried, broken. Roofs had collapsed, walls had been torn away. It was a landscape of frozen ruin. But they were alive. All 7 of them. They owed their lives to the girl they had exiled. As the survivors began to dig out, to assess the catastrophic damage, a fundamental shift occurred in the town's social physics. The old hierarchy, based on wealth and piety, had been rendered meaningless. Mr. Corwin, once the town's leading voice, was now Maeve's quietest disciple. He organized the able-bodied men, but he did so by first asking her what needed to be done. Her sanctuary in the mountain, once a symbol of her strangeness, became their only hope. Her deep larder fed them. Her knowledge of how to mend and build with what was available became the blueprint for their reconstruction. They didn't rebuild with flimsy wood. They began to quarry stone from the canyons, guided by Maeve and the lessons her father had passed down to her. They built a new central structure, a communal hall, with a great stone hearth at its center, a larger, public version of the one she had built in secret. The hearth, her hearth, became the heart of the new Providence. It was the place where they gathered for warmth, for meetings, for comfort. It was a constant, solid reminder of what had saved them. Maeve never moved back into the town proper. Her home was the mountain. But she was no longer an outcast. She was their anchor, their wise woman, the quiet leader they turned to not for pronouncements, but for practical wisdom. She taught them which clays made the strongest mortar, how to read the sky for weather, where to find the hidden springs. She never spoke of the day Agnes had cast her out. She never mentioned Corwin's taunts. There was no need. The new reality was her vindication. Forgiveness was not a word that was ever spoken. It was an act, expressed in the daily deference shown to her, in the way they brought her the first of any new supply, in the way their children would bring her small gifts, a pretty rock, a bird's feather. It was a rebuilding not just of structures, but of a community soul, centered around the quiet girl and her dog, the ones who had understood the true meaning of shelter. Her knowledge, born of grief and solitude, had become their foundation. The stone had remembered the heat, and in turn, it had taught them how to live. You learn that a shelter is not just a place, but a practice. It is the accumulation of 1,000 small, correct decisions. It is the foresight to gather wood when the sun is shining, the patience to carve a shelf into stone, the wisdom to know that the most valuable things are not bought, but built. It is a competence earned in solitude, a strength forged in the quiet crucible of loss. The world will test you. It will send storms that can shatter your certainties and freeze the very heart of your community. In those moments, the loudest voices often fall silent, and the structures you once trusted reveal themselves as hollow things. The true foundations are not made of pride or proclamation, but of practical knowledge, of a quiet and stubborn refusal to be broken. You may find yourself cast out, walking toward a wilderness that others fear. You may be forced to crawl into the cracks, to make a home in the dark and forgotten places. Do not mistake this for an end. This is where the real building begins. It is in the darkness that you learn to make your own light. It is in the cold that you learn the sacred geometry of the hearth. And it is in the silence that you learn to hear the wisdom the world is waiting to offer you. The shelter you build from the pieces of your own grief may, one day, be the only thing standing, ready to offer warmth to the very people who sent you into the cold.